In 1986, a young woman was found murdered in Los Angeles. The police quickly closed the case, suspecting that the young woman had been killed during a burglary that had gone awry. Nevertheless, the authorities never managed to arrest a perpetrator. The case becomes a cold case and disappears in a drawer for decades, until a new unit takes on the case and makes a discovery that changes everything. On Monday, February 24, 1986, Sherri Rasmussen was supposed to be supervising a training session. But when her husband John left the house that morning to go to work, Sherri was still in bed. She tells him she is considering calling in sick for the day. She wasn't feeling particularly ill, but it was one of those days when she just couldn't be bothered, especially since she didn't really feel like supervising the training course. The 27-year-old manages a hospital ward and loves her job. But the bureaucratic side of the job isn't always easy for her. John tells her that she should just get up and go to the training session. But when he leaves their apartment in Van Nuys at 7:20 a.m., Sherri is still in bed. It will be the last time John sees his wife. That morning, John calls Sherri to see if she stayed home or went to the training session after all. But Sherri doesn't pick up. So John assumes that Sherri finally got herself together, went to work, and is therefore unavailable. However, he notices that the answering machine is not on. John decides to call Sherri's office. The secretary says she hasn't seen Sherri that day. But that's not necessarily unusual. Sometimes Sherri walks past the office and goes directly to her classes. After work, John runs a few errands and then drives home. There, in the driveway, he notices something strange. The door to his and Sherri's apartment is open. Sherri's car is not in its usual place. Instead, there are small shards of glass in front of the garage. And when John enters the apartment, he's confronted with a horrific scene. His wife, Sherri, is dead. She's lying on the floor in the living room. Her robe is open, her body twisted strangely, and her face bloodied and swollen. She has a bite mark on her left arm and a bullet hole in her chest. 2 more will be found later during the autopsy. Although John instinctively knows that any help will come too late, he calls 911 in the hope that his wife will somehow survive. Unfortunately, she does not. Investigators secure the scene. It looks like a fight took place in the living room. Several technical devices and decorative objects have been knocked over and damaged. There is blood on some parts of the walls. The door to a balcony upstairs has been smashed. Apparently, the perpetrator used a wool blanket from the living room to muffle the noise of the shots. Sherri's car, which had disappeared from the driveway, was found a week later in Van Nuys. It was parked in the middle of the street. The keys were in the ignition. Several fingerprints, a brown strand of hair, and a small bloodstain were found in the car. Although there are no witnesses, the police quickly have a suspicion as to who might be responsible for the death of Sherri Rasmussen. In the weeks before her death, at the end of February 1986, there were several burglaries in the neighborhood. During one of these burglaries, the perpetrators, who witnesses say were 2 Latin American men, also attacked a woman. The police now believe that the murder of Sherri Rasmussen was a robbery gone awry by these 2 thieves. It fits with the fact that technical devices such as the stereo and speakers were knocked over. Sherri probably came down because of the noise and caught the burglars in the act. Then they shot the young woman and fled in a hurry in their car. That is the police's assumption. And that, although Sherri's parents have a completely different suspicion. A suspicion that will shock everyone. Most of all, probably Sherri's husband. At the age of just 27, Sherri is already running a hospital ward and lecturing at her alma mater, UCLA. She's following in the footsteps of her father, a successful dentist with his own practice. Her parents are very proud of their daughter and her career. Sherri met her future husband John Rutten in the summer of 1984. They married at the end of the following year. Sherri's family gets along well with John and thinks he's a nice guy. And that's despite the fact that Sherri's parents would have liked a different type of man for her. Someone who is more successful, more established in life, maybe a doctor. But the main thing for the Rasmussens is that their daughter Sherri is happy. However, Sherri's father in particular became uneasy a few weeks before his daughter's wedding to John. One evening, Sherri called him crying. She was distraught and feeling insecure. In the weeks leading up to the wedding in the fall of 1985, a strange woman showed up at Sherri and John's apartment several times. Sherri doesn't tell her father the woman's name, but she does say that it's a woman John once had something with. Sherri says John told her the relationship was never serious and that he knew this other woman from college. Nevertheless, this woman shows up at Sherri's house a few times, even when John is not at home. Once, this woman even came to her at work. When Sherri Rasmussen is found murdered, her father remembers this account. He passes it on to the police immediately and asks whether Sherri's husband's ex-girlfriend has already been questioned. However, the police decline. The investigators are firmly convinced that it was a robbery murder and believe that the two unknown men are the perpetrators. Accordingly, the investigation is being conducted in this direction. One of the police officers speaks briefly with John about the objections of Sherri's father. When he says that he cannot imagine that his ex-girlfriend could have anything to do with Sherri's death, the matter is closed for the police. Perhaps even more than that. Because years later, it will be noticed that the statements of Sherri's father about John's ex-girlfriend are missing. And the same goes for the records of the interview in which John himself spoke about his ex. It is still not entirely clear how these documents could have been lost. But perhaps the loss of the statements could be connected to the fact that the name of John's ex-girlfriend is Stephanie Lazarus, and that she herself works as a police officer. The case of Sherri Rasmussen becomes a cold case. But the father of the murdered woman never gives up. He just can't get Sherri's reports of her husband's ex-girlfriend's sudden visits out of his head. Over the years, he repeatedly checks with the police and asks to question Stephanie Lazarus. After a few years, he also tries to get DNA tests carried out. After all, fingerprints and hair were found in Sherri's car. In addition, a saliva sample was taken from the bite mark on her arm. Sherri's father even offered to pay for these DNA tests himself. But the police refused, saying that without a suspect, it would be nonsensical to conduct such a test. At some point, the saliva sample even disappeared from the evidence database. The comments of Sherri's family about Stephanie Lazarus continue to be ignored. Although John, Sherri's husband, has clearly stated to the police that he does not believe Stephanie was involved in the case, he continues to inquire. Especially when he meets Stephanie again in Cuba in 1989, 3 years after Sherri's death. When the investigators assure him that Stephanie Lazarus is not a suspect in the murder of Sherri Rasmussen, John and Stephanie even get back together for a short time. However, the relationship does not last long. The two eventually separate and meet new partners, whom they marry. In 2004, the case of Sherri Rasmussen is reopened by a cold case unit. The saliva samples also turned up again. They had been in a freezer for 18 years, apparently forgotten and not properly sorted. But the sample was still intact and was analyzed properly for the first time. Although there was no match in the police database, the DNA provided a breakthrough in the case. It belonged to a female person. Whoever bit Sherri in the arm was a woman. And that contradicts the previous investigative hypothesis, according to which the two male burglars killed Sherri Rasmussen. Nevertheless, this does not help the investigators of the cold case unit any further, because there is no longer any reference to the suspicion of Sherri's father in the police records. As already mentioned, this was never noted or someone made it disappear. Accordingly, the name Stephanie Lazarus does not appear in the files as a person of interest, so the case is put back on the shelf. But in 2009, 5 years later, The cold case is reopened. When the misidentification of Sherri's killers as the two unknown burglars is noticed, the investigators try to look at the case from a different angle. The DNA evidence now suggests that there is no perpetrator, but a female perpetrator. The two unknown burglars are therefore eliminated as suspects, and with that, the entire previous course of events is also refuted. Because if there were no burglars, there may not have been a failed robbery that Sherri interrupted. When the investigators reevaluate the evidence based on the files, a different picture emerges. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door of the house. Only the balcony door on the upper floor was damaged. It is therefore possible that the perpetrator surprised Sherri on the upper floor. Sherri could have run downstairs to escape from the apartment, and that's where the fight could have taken place, damaging the technical and decorative objects. Furthermore, Sherri's injuries do not really fit with a shot in the heat of the moment. She was shot in the center of the chest. The whole thing looks more like an execution than a robbery and murder. The cold case unit talks to Sherri's widower, John Rutten, again. When he hears that the perpetrator's DNA has turned out to be female, he casually mentions that Sherri's father always suspected John's ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus. John assumes that the cold case unit is aware of this suspicion. He has no way of knowing that the records of statements regarding Stephanie Lazarus are missing from the files. The investigators are understandably shocked when they hear about this suspicion and that Stephanie Lazarus is, so to speak, a colleague. She is still active in the police force and has worked her way up over the years. The investigators are taking a closer look at the whole case. Stephanie Lazarus was not on duty the day she was murdered. As a police officer, she had access to a weapon. And Stephanie Lazarus reported her second weapon stolen only a few weeks after Sherri's murder. Many coincidences. Too many. The investigators therefore suspect that Stephanie herself made the weapon disappear. And for good reason. She is the murderer of Sherri Rasmussen. The suspicions of the cold case unit are concrete enough to justify a DNA comparison. In May 2009, colleagues secretly followed Stephanie Lazarus to a shopping mall and secured a beverage cup that the suspect disposed of in a trash can. Stephanie's DNA is extracted from the cup and compared with the saliva sample from the bite wound of the murdered Sherri. And there is a match. For the police, it is now crystal clear. The person who murdered Sherri Rasmussen was police officer Stephanie Lazarus. Probably out of jealousy, the investigators initially questioned Stephanie under the pretext of having only come across her name by chance in the file on the Sherri Rasmussen case. Stephanie tries for over an hour to talk her way out of everything. She claims not to remember very well. The incident happened more than 20 years ago. She's no longer sure whether she ever met Sherri at all.
Had you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Do you remember her name or anything, or? Or what she did for a living, or where she worked, or anything about her?
Well, I think I'm going to say that I think she was a nurse.
At this point, Stephanie has no idea that her own colleagues have already convicted her on the basis of the DNA samples. When the police officers substantiate their accusations against Stephanie, she vehemently denies everything. Although the circumstantial evidence against her is clear, the evidence is sufficient to charge Stephanie Lazarus with the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. But even in court, Stephanie insists on her innocence. Nevertheless, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of the murder of Sherri Rasmussen in March 2012. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Sherri's niece said after the trial against Stephanie that the verdict was a slap in the face for the family. It is not fair that Sherri Rasmussen's killer only has to go to prison for 27 years, after not only living with her crime every day for 27 years, but also continuing to work as a police officer and seemingly not even thinking about turning herself in. At the end of 2023, there are some reports that Stephanie's early release on parole has been considered. The application was denied. And that's it for today's case. What do you think of today's case? What do you think of 27 years in prison, even though she killed a person and was still at large 27 years after the murder? And what do you think of the police work? How can it be that the police focused so much on the burglar theory even though the evidence was actually clear? A simple DNA comparison would have provided clarity from the start. Feel free to write your opinion in the comments. And otherwise, feel free to leave a like, comment, and/or subscription. With that, you really support the channel extremely. Otherwise, there is not much more to say. I wish you a good morning, noon, or evening, or depending on when you watch the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao guys.